episode is going to be What's Up with Us. My name's Surrendam.
And I'm Cody.
Moving forward, every week we're going to give you a new video touching on different topics. Today we're going to get into What's Up with Qualified Immunity.
Yeah.
Just to give you guys some pre-historical context, what's going on today in modern culture, and then how do we move forward with a lot of what's going on.
Yeah. Try and hit you with the stuff you didn't know about and you didn't even knew existed, and you definitely didn't know that you needed to know about, but things that will have an impact on the way you understand and navigate the modern world and current events. So we're gonna try and make you a little bit smarter every week. My name is Cody. I am a civil rights attorney. I grew up here in the Bay Area. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. I obviously went to law school, so I do know the law, at least my area of it. I spent a lot of time reading, economics and history and political theory. So hopefully all that useless, at least until now, useless knowledge that I've picked up will come in handy, and I can, set you guys up with a little bit of it.
My name's Surrendam. I was born in Ethiopia, raised in Seattle. I went to Oregon, which is where we met. Studied business and social behavior. So I've got some psychology and sociology mixed in there. I think between the two of us, we've got legal and business context covered.
We have pretty good coverage.
And hopefully we make it a little bit funny.
Yeah.
Like a little bit
Yeah, it'll at least be a little entertaining, I think. So, yeah, that's the plan anyway.
So welcome.
Yeah.
What's up with us? We've got some exciting episodes. We've got political correctness coming up, an episode on Karens.
I mean, I think we might just have like a segment every week on Karens, honestly, because like there's so much Karen content out there.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried it's just going to turn into like the Karen's Corner show. And
Okay, today's episode is What's Up with Qualified Immunity. And before we get into talking about qualified immunity, we need to give you some pre-context as to why that's important. So at the end of this video, you're going to learn why bad cops stay on the police force and are not held accountable once we get through this explanation.
Sure. Well, obviously there's the internal process that each police department has. You can file a complaint with them. It's pretty unlikely they'll do something about it. In the most egregious situations, the government might choose to prosecute the offending officer in court, in a criminal case like any other, like we've seen in Minneapolis with the state attorney general filing those charges. And the final option, and this isn't exclusive with the other two, is filing a civil suit in court, the same way you would for a car accident or anything else like that. And that is one mechanism by which police can be held accountable for misconduct.
And so during the Andrew Johnson administration, during the 13th and 14th Amendment, slaves weren't actually given their full rights. There was something called Black Code, in which they had to have permits and show that they worked for a plantation owner. And oftentimes it resulted in them being arrested. And so rather than having their full rights like any other citizen, they didn't have a way to really get out of that, right?
Yeah, so they had constitutional and statutory rights on paper, but in practice, in the Reconstruction South, they had no mechanism to enforce or prevent the violation of their rights. So if their rights were violated, there was nothing they can do about it. So in practice, in many places, a system that looked a lot like antebellum slavery was beginning to form by the late 1860s.
Okay, and so how did we get to having civil lawsuits?
Well, in 1871, Congress passed what's called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It's also called the Civil Rights Act of 1871. There's a bunch of stuff in it, but probably the most important part of it is a statute that's now known as Section 1983. And what 1983 does is it gives any citizen the right to sue any state officer or agent in federal court for money damages. And before Section 1983, you could not sue state agents for money damages, and you couldn't necessarily sue in federal court. You were stuck in the state courts, which were dominated by the plantation interests and things like that. So that, like we talked about, there was no mechanism before this for freed slaves to enforce their right and really take their freedom. And 1983 gave them the ability to do that. But the
at a state level,
right, the state and its officers typically have immunity and can only be sued unless there's a specific statute. Yeah, and it's important that federal courts only have jurisdiction over certain cases that Congress has given them jurisdiction over. So 1983 gave federal courts the jurisdiction to hear those cases. And subsequent to 1983, when someone's rights were violated by the state, as we saw was often the case, they were able to go to court, sue the state agent that violated their rights, and get money back from the state to compensate them, which, as you can imagine, was a very effective deterrent to rights violations, because states don't want to have to pay out a bunch of money to people.
Okay. Now that we've discussed why we tend to move towards civil litigation, now let's go into how qualified immunity plays into it. Cody, how would you define qualified immunity?
Well, qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that the Supreme Court made up in the 1960s, and it makes it very difficult to sue law enforcement agents in court, almost no matter how egregious their violations are. And qualified immunity basically stands for the principle that you can only sue for the violation of rights that were clearly established at the time of their violation. And in practice, it means that there has to have been a case exactly like your case in which the court wrote an opinion saying that this constitutes a violation of rights. And if you don't have that, the officer is entitled to qualified immunity and cannot be sued at all. Your case will be dismissed as soon as you get into court.
So how do you defeat qualified immunity?
To defeat it, you have to find a case from the past that's exactly like your case with the same facts, where the court said this set of facts violates the Constitution, which basically the idea is it puts the officers on notice that they're not allowed to do that. So if you can find a case just like yours putting the officer on notice, then you can defeat qualified immunity.
So to what degree can the cases differ or be similar in order to overcome qualified immunity?
It depends a bit from court to court, but in general, it's quite a strict rule. There was a recent case before the Ninth Circuit in which the plaintiff had surrendered to police by getting on his knees and putting his hands up in the air and saying he surrendered, and the police set their canine loose on him, which attacked him. And there had been a previous case in which the Ninth Circuit found it was unconstitutional to release a police dog on a surrendering suspect. So the plaintiff in the latter case pointed to that case and said, this is a clearly established right, there should be no qualified immunity. But the court actually said there was qualified immunity because in the previous case, the suspect had lie prone, face down on his stomach. And they said that because this plaintiff was only on his knees with his hands up, it was a different case. And so the officer wasn't on notice, that was unlawful, and the case was dismissed.
Okay, so let's say a cop does get in trouble and a case actually proves that qualified immunity isn't applicable. What are some of the implications to everyone else and greater society?
Sure. Well, as a practical matter for that plaintiff that defeats qualified immunity in that case, it means they're going to have a chance to have their case heard by a jury and potentially get money damages, either through a settlement or because they win at the jury trial. But if that officer does end up losing, it's not going to be the officer that pays out because the officer doesn't have any money. It's going to be the police department, and the police department typically carries insurance to pay for those kinds of cases. And so if insurance has to, pay out for an officer, a few times, they're going to tell the police department that they need to get rid of that police officer, or they're going to drop their insurance coverage. So it's really can be a powerful mechanism, but because of qualified immunity, it's not common enough to actually really affect police departments' hiring or personnel policy, because it's so rare that the insurers aren't that worried about these kinds of lawsuits.
So in layman terms, how does the whole insurance thing come into play? How does that work?
Sure. Well, think about, maybe when you were a teenager or something like that, your parents put you on their auto insurance, and suppose then a few years later they put your sister on, so they've got the four of you on that plan. Well, suppose your sister keeps getting into car accidents. She gets into 5 car accidents in 2 years. Well, the insurance is going to keep increasing your premium, and eventually your insurance carrier is going to say, we are no longer going to insure you unless you take your sister off the plan because she's simply too expensive to insure. Well, it's the same effect with police departments, right? If a police department is being sued dozens of times a year because their officers are out of control, an insurance company is going to either crank their premium so far through the roof that they can't pay them, or they're just going to drop them. And police departments can't not have insurance because the judgments can be very, very large, talking millions of dollars. So a few bad cases in a year, and the police department could basically bankrupt a city. And in fact, there was a city in Southern California that lost its police department because they had lost so many civil rights cases that they couldn't get insurance anymore. And it was a small town, and they couldn't, risk a big judgment. Would have been many times their annual budget. So they had to get rid of police. And, if you didn't have qualified immunity and it was easier to sue, police departments would be forced to get rid of their more riskier cops because they would get sued and screw up their insurance coverage.
Money, 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 money. Okay. I mean, this is all really interesting. So basically sounds like cops don't get in trouble, so the insurance companies don't have to pay out.
That's more or less it. There's plenty of problems with police departments, policing in general in this country, but qualified immunity in particular is, it's a big barrier to any kind of structural reform. And as long as there's qualified immunity, lots of sort of other changes or reforms probably won't have that much of an effect, because if you can't hold bad cops liable, it's going to be very difficult to get decent policing.
Does this sound familiar? Derek Chauvin?
Yeah, and in fact, that's a perfect example. I think that, he had something like 20 complaints, something.
Yeah, it was something crazy.
In that area. I don't know, to what extent any of them actually turned into lawsuits. But, you hear these cases about a police officer that killed somebody, who had, some of these people have 50, 60, 70 complaints. And had been sued multiple times, and if the officer couldn't get off on qualified immunity right away, good chance officers like that wouldn't be on the force, because they would just be too expensive to keep on the insurance coverage.
You heard it here.
Yeah.
So what do we do moving forward? How do we move forward from this, considering?
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that qualified immunity was just made up by the Supreme Court. It's not in the text of the Ku Klux Klan Act or of Section 1983. It's not in the text of the Constitution, and it's not in the text of anywhere. So the Supreme Court made it up, and the Supreme Court could abolish it if it wanted to. In fact, there are some potential cases that the Supreme Court may be looking at for the next term, re-examining qualified immunity. There's at least 3 justices who probably seem inclined to at least rethink it. So it's possible the Supreme Court could just get rid of it. And remember that qualified immunity was not the law until the 1960s. So it was almost 100 years of Section 1983 before there was any qualified immunity. So you could simply go back to what it was, in the 1950s. It's also possible it could be changed by statute. The police reform legislation that congressional Democrats have come up with does include limiting qualified immunity. Doesn't seem like that's going to pass. So, I wouldn't hold your breath necessarily, but it does seem like this is a little bit of a tipping point for qualified immunity as more people find out about it. I think it's become, a little bit of a flashpoint. I think people instinctively understand that it's a little bit of a silly rule. And, it seems like one way or another, its time, is going to come pretty soon. But as long as we have it, it's a big barrier to holding police accountable.
Nice. Right on. You heard it here.
Yeah.
Qualified immunity.
It's real bad, folks. It's bad. Yeah.
Ooh.
Cool. That's pretty good, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. With some editing, I feel like we can clean it up.
Oh,
I think that's the take.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, what he said.
Yeah.